Hi, everyone. I'm Janet Bruff, Senior Development Officer at the Georgian Bay Land Trust, and welcome to tonight's presentation. Our guest speaker is Kyle Sherman, winner of the King Family Bursary in 2019, who will chat with us about his plein-air painting project on Georgian Bay and how the act of painting as a land steward has evolved through his two subsequent projects at the Fairy Creek Blockades in BC and Harvest Moon Society in Manitoba. But before I turn it over to Kyle, I always would like to take an opportunity to thank you all for your commitment to conservation and to the Georgian Bay Land Trust this last year. What should be on the screen right now is our impact statement, which highlights the 5 strategic pillars: plan, protect, steward, learn, and inspire. Under the plan pillar, you all, in your generosity, assisted the GBLT in playing a leadership role in a collaborative natural conservation plan, mapping connectivity between habitats, mapping corridors for species movement, and looking at factors for promoting climate change resilience. And you helped to protect 3 new conservation properties on Georgian Bay, bringing the total to 67, which now secures habitat for species at risk and places for people to connect with nature. And we're excited to let you know we've got a couple more in the pipeline. So when we can announce those, we certainly will. In the steward pillar, we have an amazing amount of stewards who help and volunteer, 1,300 to be exact, and they help protect places from the Port Severn coast to the North Channel, protecting over 7,500 acres of Georgian Bay wilderness. So to any volunteers who may be on tonight, thank you. We just could not do what we do without you. And under the learn pillar, our conservation lands always serve as resource for environmental research. You supported a new partnership with scientists from Western University who were in residence this past summer to study songbird behavior. Plus, we added 5 new Motus towers, providing more research and insight into how we protect species in decline. And in the Inspire pillar, last year there were over 2,000 recreational visits to our community properties, plus the execution of Conservation Quest, our education and outreach program, which teaches young conservationists the fascinating ecology of the region and what they can do to protect it. So together, all of us, together we can make a difference. So we ask you today to please consider putting the Georgian Bay Land Trust on your charitable giving list this year. Together we can all make a difference and protect this incredible place that we all love forever. So it is now my true honor to be able to introduce you to Kyle Sherman. Kyle centers his contemporary landscape paintings around the narratives of ecological crisis in some of the most unique and threatened areas in Canada. Bearing witness to environmental change, Kyle's works on jute acts as documentation of destruction that at first glance present themselves as objects of beauty. Controlled brushwork and a nuanced color palette give space for the artist to depict his lived experience as a forest protector. Kyle completed his Bachelor of Fine Arts at the Ontario College of Art and Design, and then completed his Master of Fine Arts at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, where he was given the great honor of valedictorian. This then led to his residency at the Fairy Creek Blockades. I know he will finish that storyline for you, so it is indeed my pleasure to pass it over to you, Kyle. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you very much, Janet. That's a really lovely introduction. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Sounds good. I'm not accidentally muted. Janet's smile says no. Okay. So I'm going to share a bunch of slides with you tonight, and I'm going to talk through my work in a pretty linear way. I like going through this stuff chronological. And tonight, I think it's really fitting to be talking with you folks with GBLT, because that was really the first opportunity where I sought out to actually act as a land steward through the mechanism of painting. And at the time, I didn't really know what that meant. I just finished my master's degree. I had a real affinity for the group of 7. for the land around Southern Ontario, which I'd gotten to know through other camping trips and whatnot. And when this opportunity came up with Georgian Bay Land Trust, it just seemed like the right place for me to start to try and put these things together. And as Janet was laying out there with the conservation plan that you have going forward, there's a really beautiful and inspiring group of people that are working on these things every day, thinking through how can we be better land stewards? How can we invite people like artists to come to our land to find ways to spread the word of conservation. As I'm going to explain at later parts in my painting practice, thinking about what it means to be a painter in the spirit of being a land steward as well. That's not necessarily all the time the case in this country. So I'm going to turn on the screen share here and start walking you through some slides to show my work. So this is a little bit of a start at the end slide here, just kind of my title slide. This is me at the Fairy Creek Blockades painting in front of Big Lonely Doug. And we're going to get there in just a moment. But to start, we got to start at Georgian Bay. So I just finished grad school. I'd won the King family bursary. I had some money to come out and start my research. And the plan was to make 4 separate trips centered around the different seasons, where I was going to, initially the thought was I'm going to chase some group of 7 ghosts here. I'm going to go try and find the spots where they worked and use the infrastructure of land conservation, all the different islands and whatnot that the GBLT was, I was very lucky that they were able to give me access and ferry me around to these places. And when I got there, I was going to see what I found and just kind of let that experience guide my time as a painter. I started out working with a musician named Jesse Matus, and pretty quickly our projects branched off in separate directions. But I think that ended up being a really positive thing for me because it gave me a lot more meditative space on my own, which increasingly has become a really important part of my painting practice. So I spent a lot of time sitting on rocks and kind of observing what I saw, watercolors to get myself started for the most part, and a lot of photographs. There's a big harvest moon when we were out there, and that really stuck with me for the first trip. But another thing that stuck with me too was the water level. And this is going to be a reoccurring theme, not just in my time at Georgian Bay, but throughout all of my work. These kind of subtle reminders of how the climate is changing in ways that maybe we didn't predict or maybe that we couldn't foresee up until it's right in our face. So at the time, there's a lot of flooded docks. There's a lot of shorelines that were entirely changed. Nobody really knew what to do about it, it felt like. I didn't really have an answer either, but on my canoe, I filled up my canoe with all the stuff that I needed. And I went out to a few different islands while I was there, paddled around, painted out of my canoe. At one point, I set up my tent in a little boat shack on Barb's kind of bunky house thing here that had boats stashed in it to keep myself out of the wind. And I painted. I just made a whole bunch of watercolors. I really wanted to just kind of be saturated in the environment and let that kind of guide my intention. After a few weeks out there, I went back to my studio and I got to work. I knew that I had an exhibition coming up, and just at that time, it was only about 6 weeks away. This is all in the fall of 2019. So I just got to work. I started taking those reference photos and reference paintings that I made on site, either in my canoe or on the shore, and I started turning them into larger oil paintings in my studio. So just to flip through a couple in kind of a more direct way. So this was sitting on an island in Georgian Bay, and it eventually became this painting here. Trying to really just allow kind of the more natural things that happen when you're painting outside. The wind might push your boat in one direction, and that changes the composition or changes the way you look at a tree. So trying to let all those kind of things that just happen naturally through plein air painting when you're being affected by the environment, allow that to seep its way into my studio to start to change some of my colors and compositions. This was the island and the cabin directly across the little strait from where the big house was on Barb's Island, right by West Wind Island there. I brought that back into my studio and turned it into this painting here. Very similar composition. That big harvest moon that was all over the lake on those nights that was really bright and shining. And then this painting here, and this was the first one where I sat and looked at a flood, where I'd seen one of those pine trees kind of half sunk, about a foot or so deep in the water. And I sat there, pulled up my canoe, sat there on the shoreline, and I painted that half sunk pine and brought it into my studio. And I wasn't really sure quite what that meant yet. I was kind of just dipping my toe in the water of painting a sunken tree. But I really love those pine trees. Obviously, I really loved all those Georgian Bay shapes and all those Georgian Bay colors that are so connected to the group of 7 in particular. And I really wanted to try and lean into some of that iconography. And of course, that pine tree was the first starting place. So all of this work happened, the work on canvas, the bigger paintings, it all happened in about a 6-week window. And then all the paintings got sent back to Toronto to Angel Gallery, where my first solo show with the gallery opened. This is in fall of 2019. I think a few of you probably came and attended the show, whether it was at the opening or otherwise. It felt like a really kind of big step for me at the time, starting to think about not just how can I make paintings that show these things, but how can I bring them to a new audience? How can I take these scenes of subtle kind of signifiers of climate change and bring them into urban settings where people are maybe going to think a little bit differently about what's actually happening with our environment. A couple months after that, I went back out in a very different climate, and I stayed in Honey Harbor. And well, there was a heck of a lot of ice still, but it was a really long, this is in like March. Now we're talking in March of 2020. So there's a lot of ice, a lot of kind of in between melted areas, a lot of strange kind of sunken tree shapes going on. And I was very, very grateful to have Bill's help. He let me stay at his cabin. He let me kind of rope around his land. He also, of course, he provided a great place for me to paint. He provided a really awesome space for me to get out of the cold at the end of the day and go finish up my work. But he also let me borrow his ATV, which was awesome for like a plein air painter looking to get into some remote areas. And that's what I did for about maybe 10 or so days, until I got a call from my dad, and he said, Trudeau just closed the border with the US. COVID's really bad. I think you should come home now. So that's what I did. I had to go home, but I got quite a few images, and I got quite a few drawings. And I thought, well, I'm not going to let this stop me. I'm just going to keep pushing ahead with this work. It'll just be a little bit different. It'll have to be remote. But this image here really kind of stuck with me the most. It ended up becoming the base of a handful of paintings, as well as that study. So that's a little shot from my studio with one of the studies that I made of the island, as well as a printout that I just made on a bad old printer, and then the painting that I'm starting to work on the right. And I ended up with this painting here, which was not just dipping my toe in the water anymore. I was like, I'm going to really paint those trees sunken. The ice was all dammed up. I saw the high water in the fall. Now I've got an opportunity to start to interpret that. And again, really thinking about the moon as kind of this thing that yes, pulls and pushes the water and changes the tide and how high it's going to come up our shores. But also, there's got to be something else going on to make the trees sink that deep. So I leaned a little bit further into it and really relied on that composition to kind of be the vehicle for some of those shapes. This painting was in the auction in support of GBLT last year, I believe. I think I lost track of time in COVID, but I was very grateful to be able to help raise a little bit of money for conservation acts out there. Yeah, and then I was like, okay, well, maybe it's getting a little bit longer here with COVID. I'm not really going anywhere. So I started revisiting some of the images that I took in the summer. Started thinking through some of the moon and some of those pine shapes again. I knew that I had another exhibition coming up in Toronto at Angel Gallery, and I really wanted to have another body of work that really spoke to my experience, not just where my studio was out west, but also back with my time at Georgian Bay. So I kept pushing through that work, and it felt good at the time. But this is just one little thing that snuck in here. I also painted a paddle based on some of my time at Georgian Bay, which was used for the Camp Ooch Trillium project, which helps kids with cancer go to camp. And this paddle raised money to make that possible. But at a certain point, I couldn't just be sitting alone in my studio anymore. So I started going out on my canoe and making paintings where I was living at the time on Vancouver Island. And often my dad would go out on his little fishing boat and troll around his little fishing kayak. And I'd go out on my canoe and I'd either pull up on the shore and paint. And sometimes I'd sit right in my canoe and keep painting. And at the time I was thinking, well, this is just a way to supplement that other work that I'm doing. I've got this big project going on out east. This will be a good way to kind of keep my hands moving, find some new shapes, new colors as a result of sitting right on the water painting. But I was confronted with some stuff that I knew was there, but I guess I didn't really know how to expect, or I didn't expect that it would affect me so personally. And I'm talking about some of those really iconic scenes of climate change that exist on the West Coast. Those shaved down mountainsides, those clear-cut patches, remnants of forest fire, incredible overlogging, overforestation, flooded valleys turned into rivers for either recreational purposes or for damming up water supplies for cities, just complete destruction of the landscape as well as all the ecosystems around it. And what started out as a thing that I was going to do to try and explore some new shapes and some new colors, well, it affected me in such a way that I realized that needed to become the fulcrum of my painting practice. So oftentimes the painting that I was making on the canoe, they were pretty colorful. They weren't too much realistically depicting the difficult clear-cut forest sides. You know, it kind of leaked a little bit in, but I used that imagery that I was making on the boat to start to affect the things that I was making back in the studio. So now we're maybe about 6 months past that March where I got called back from Georgian Bay. I'm kind of like everybody else in a little bit of COVID uncertainty, and I realized that I needed to start painting the things that were right in front of my face. So this is one of the first paintings that really was eye-opening to me. The intention was I was going to flip the narrative. I was going to make it so that the only thing that was on fire was the cabin, and that the rest of the hillside would still be relatively okay, maybe a few little fires on the hillside. But I just painted what I saw, which was a whole bunch of those trees kind of bumping up on the shoreline up against the cabin. I remember showing this painting to an advisor of mine, a close friend, somebody that I really trust, talking about painting. And he read the whole painting, he talked through the whole painting, and right at the end he said, and then the last thing that you realize is you look at what's bumped up on the shoreline there and you think, logging. And it sounds silly, but that's the first time that anybody had ever put it to me that bluntly. Like, I understood what a clear cut was. I understood what that type of level of destruction was, but putting it into one word, logging, you know, that like turned on a light for me. What does that exactly mean? So I started to imagine myself completely submerged in this landscape, which at the time I was. My studio was in basically a concrete slab with some plywood walls around it that I installed a makeshift wood stove in. I was completely given over to the elements while I was painting in my studio, as well as while I was painting out in the field. And I started to represent myself as kind of this, I don't want to say like hopeless figure, you know, but kind of this figure within the landscape that was completely given over to the realities of how difficult that landscape is. I remember smoke coming from the forest fire and sitting right in the lake, right by my studio, and it coming in the window to my bedroom at night, you know, and realizing that it's inescapable. You couldn't really get away from these things out in BC where I was living on Vancouver Island. So the work started blending together. This is me in my studio. There's that painting that I showed a moment ago from Georgian Bay. There's me working on a new big painting that ended up having a pretty considerable forest fire on the hillside, as well as kind of a more colorful floral sort of looking painting that was just a lavender bush outside of my studio. So as a result of the isolation from the pandemic, I ended up in a situation where I started to paint these kind of imagined landscapes, almost these landscapes that were kind of no place, or maybe referenced several places at once. But at the center of it was what are the repercussions of our changing environment? What's at stake here? And what can I do as a painter to maybe try and affect change? I still at the time felt a little bit hopeless. I suppose, you know, it kind of feels insurmountable. How am I going to be able to do anything? I'm just one guy with a paintbrush. So I made this portrait here of myself in my studio at Shawnigan Lake. with a bunch of logs bumped up all around the cabin. I'm just kind of standing in the middle of the cabin, holding my paintbrush, wondering what the heck to do about it. And I realized that I needed to jump in. It was no longer satisfactory for me to just sit there and paint about it from the isolation of my studio. I needed to actually dive right in and do some meaningful work here. And I really don't think that I would have had the courage to do that if it wasn't for the experience that I had with Georgian Bay. That term land steward was something that I felt that I knew how to embody because of that experience, just from thinking about those floods and from listening to folks like Janet and Sarah talk about these things, or from having conversations with folks at the gas station at Go Home Bay. Or I remember pulling my canoe out and learning about berries, overpicking of berries and things like that, you know. And if I didn't have these kind of just like side tangential conversations that I started to knit together into this bigger picture of what does being a land steward mean, I never would have had the courage to jump right in. I sent all that work back to Toronto, where I had my second solo exhibition at Angel Gallery. This opened in March of 2021. Still kind of in the middle of pandemic days. I was unable to travel to the show, and that was a little bit heartbreaking. Of course, really wished that I had gone to the show, but I felt good knowing that I had made a body of work that reflected the reality of what I was experiencing out west. And yeah, I felt good that I had somewhere to go. So I went to the Fairy Creek Blockades. I got invited to be an artist in residence at Eden Grove on unceded Pacheedaht territory. Yeah, and I didn't really know what I was getting into. This was me diving in. You know, I knew that there was old growth logging happening there, and I knew that there was 2.7% left, and that was it. And I knew that those hillsides that I'd seen clear cut on my canoe were the same hillsides that we were trying to save out at Fairy Creek. And I just went, and I would figure it out when I get there. So as hard as it was in some places, there was other opportunities out there where you realize how important these trees are. Ancient forests, they absorb more carbon than any other ecosystem on Earth. They are the most carbon dense ecosystems on Earth by far. And when we clear cut them, that carbon gets rapidly released back into the atmosphere. Old growth logging in BC now puts more carbon back into the air than the entire Albertan oil sands. The government in BC is constantly trying to come up with new or short deferrals to maybe move logging or reposition logging for a few years at a time. But their contracts to the industry in which is extracting these trees, those contracts are so big that they're just pushing ahead. So there's this policy of talk and log, and there's kind of, well, it felt like there was nothing we could do about it until, in my case, it was Fairy Creek Blockades that really kind of brought me into this situation where I felt like I could actually do something about it. You know, going out into this environment where it's climate change in real time. You can see the devastation. You can see the white, sun-bleached mess of logging to the left, you know, where that's that decomposition that's pushing that carbon back into the air. It's happening in just a few seasons. And right on the other side of the road, there's an old growth forest with 1,000-year-old fir trees and cedar trees. At Eden Camp, I spent a lot of my time camping beside Big Lonely Doug, which might be a tree that some of you are familiar with. It's the second tallest fir tree in Canada, about 72.5 meters tall. There's a book about it. It's standing alone in a clear cut. In 2011, a feller saw the tree when he was marking the grove to be cut, and he said, "I've never seen a tree that big," and he marked it to be saved. And when they came through with the saws, they respected that line. And now it's just standing there in the middle of the clear cut all by itself. But it was a stark reminder for me to see that tree and remember this painting when, of course, going to Emily Carr. Emily Carr is one of my favorite painters. So to see that tree really reminded me of this painting of hers, and just kind of that notion that, like, we've been doing that type of stuff to our land for a long time, and painters have been involved in pointing out how destructive that can be to not just the land, but to ourselves. You know, they've been doing it in 1935. Emily Carr made that painting, you know, so this is not new. And when I saw, when I made that link for myself, I thought, well, maybe this isn't going to be too overwhelming after all. Maybe I can do something about it. So this was our little studio tent on the side of the logging road, a few 100 meters away from Doug. That's my yellow truck there. When it was too rainy, I would paint in the studio tent, but mostly I'd paint outside. So that's me on the cut line that is Eden Grove, looking down into the creek that's supposed to have a 50-meter buffer around it for logging. But of course, they cut right up to the line and pinched all the salmon out of the creek. They're now gone. And I stood there and painted the line along Eden. But while I was out there, there was all these incredible people there that were setting up camp. You know, RCMP enforcement hadn't started yet. They were holding down the fort, so to say. You know, they're just on the road. There was a watch camp, and I realized quickly that I needed to put these people in the paintings too. So this painting I just called Forest Protector. It was the first time that I painted somebody in that way. I just wanted to show like that conviction of like this one small person who it seems like maybe they can't do anything, but by just simply putting their body there, you know, by just going there and saying like, I'm not going to stand for this anymore. Something felt really powerful about that. This is the second plein air painting that I made, a similar sentiment, but I wanted to push it even further, maybe the same way that I felt that I needed to dive in when I saw these people out there that had already dove in all the way. I wanted to paint them in the act of showing that power that they have within themselves. I was making this painting on the first day that I got served the injunction when Teal Jones, the logging company, and the RCMP representative came up the hill and they saw me painting. The painting was leaning right up against the truck, just like that. And their job that day was to hand me the paperwork that told me that it was illegal for me to be there based on the Supreme Court's order of the government of BC. And they were unable to do their job. They were really distracted by the painting, and the guy fumbled his words and he ended up folding up the paper and putting it in his pocket. And they came back the next day. And I remember thinking in that moment, again, maybe there's something to this, you know, another one of those little building blocks that kind of made me think maybe there's actually a way that some change can be affected as a result of making paintings, just from this one little half-finished painting leaning up against my truck. That made me want to go further into the grove, get off the road, and actually go carry paintings into the bush and make them in a little bit more surrounded environment. At this time, I was working with a painter named Jeremy Herndall, and here I'm painting beside a waterfall that was really, really loud, rushing rapid. So we painted back to back so that in the event that a cougar came, it would think that we were a team and we weren't just going to be cougar bait. You know, the waterfall was too loud to be able to hear if a cougar was going to sneak up on us. And this is the painting that I made in that situation there, just trying to really exaggerate how tall and big those trees can be, while also just showing all the accumulation of the logs on the hillside, as well as in the foreground. And then I guess imagining myself as a little bit of like somebody that can maybe see into the future, you know, painting those trees as though they're on fire in the painting. Around that time, RCMP presence started picking up. They started coming around a heck of a lot more often. We were getting helicopter flyovers every day. The RCMP's job was to escort the logging company through the blockades so that they could take those trees and fulfill their contracts, which is why it had to become a blockade. It had to be a hard blockade, which meant that there was quite a bit of tactics and things that were going on. At the time, I was still really focused on painting, but I could also start to feel my role start to transition to somebody that wasn't out just to make my own work, but also to make work that was impactful in the sense of saving the trees. But before I did that, I went and I sat on a big cedar stump one afternoon and I started painting Big Lonely Doug. I thought that it was about time that him and I spent some time together. Yeah, so that's me from that first image there, making that painting that I just shared. I'm sitting on a 1,000-year-old cedar stump just about 200 meters away from Doug, and I spent a full week there with him making that last painting. But then enforcement got pretty significant. We knew that it was happening at other camps where I was stationed. We were 65 kilometers away from cell reception. We had no way to communicate quickly between camps. Sometimes the camps were split up by 10 or 12, 15 kilometers up a logging road. So it was a lot of speculation, and the RCMP were really great at kind of faking you out, making you think that they were going to come and try and enforce the injunction on one day, but then they wouldn't show up, and everybody was kind of getting scatterbrained. So my role transitioned away from exclusively making paintings to assisting with those hard blockade tactics. But there was a lot of really creative people at the camp that I was at, Eden, a lot of people that really kind of shared a passion for not just saving the forest, but also creativity and performative thinking. So they made sure that when we flipped a bus on its side and pushed it up against the logging road, that I was there to paint the roof, so that the RCMP knew that they weren't just going to be able to walk through there easily and take those last few trees in the grove. And then the paintings began to reflect that. The paintings began to reflect that action of civil disobedience, of direct action, painting myself here in the moment in which I painted the roof of the bus with the RCMP helicopter over my head, and then imagining that the hillside was already on fire. We also installed something that we called the sleeping dragon. It was essentially a nest under the bridge. And the plan was that it would loop around the top of the bridge, and the cable would run through a truck in the middle of the bridge with the bus at the end of the bridge. And if they moved the truck, well, the nest would fall, and the forest protector that was in the nest obviously would fall into the river below. So the conceit is, we knew that we were never going to really be able to stop them. I think that there was always an understanding that the RCMP was going to win, but we could slow them down as best we could. So these really performative, intricate things that were going on all around camp, they began to really take shape under the pressure of the RCMP, as well as sleeping dragon holes, which I'll come back to. I know that that's probably a bit of a strange, vague term, but a sleeping dragon is essentially a way to lock yourself physically to the road. It takes a heck of a lot of effort, a lot of willpower to make a sleeping dragon, and it takes even more to put your body in one, that's for sure. But we were ready, we felt that we were ready. They were ready too. Yeah, and then enforcement started. I got a press pass through Focus Victoria magazine, who had interviewed me as a painter, as well as some of the other folks that were making work out there, some of the other forest protectors, and they saw value in getting me on the RCMP media list so that I can continue my work, my documentation work, safe from arrest, behind the exclusion lines at other camps. And that's what I did. But it didn't take long for the RCMP to come through my camp, Eden. And yeah, it really didn't take long at all. They took the bus, they took the flying dragon, they took the sleeping dragon. And as my last gesture at Fairy Creek before I moved on, I decided to make a large painting of the bus as it once was, and we put it behind one of the sleeping dragons that was installed at the end of the road. So that's a forest protector locked into a sleeping dragon, and that's the bus painting about 100 by 75 inches strung up in the trees where that bus used to be. And then I left, and I went to, the plan was to go to kind of like the most opposite place that I could think of. I was moving my studio back to Northwest Ontario, I should say to Northwest Ontario for the first time, even though I grew up in Winnipeg and it felt like a familiar place. I knew that I needed a break from Fairy Creek. At that point, I began to feel a little bit more anxious about enforcement and my role as press. So it was a welcome break. And I had an opportunity to go to the Harvest Moon Society in Clearwater, Manitoba. Now, this is a project that's at the beginning, and in the spirit of keeping this this presentation in a linear fashion, I wanted to put it in the presentation here, because this is what had happened. I went from making that painting of the bus strung up on the road to southwestern Manitoba in Clearwater as the artist in residence. Now, Harvest Moon Society, they host a music festival every year. They're an organic farming community. I think that I know that they're a heck of a lot more than just that, but I think that that's probably the easiest way to kind of sum up what I thought I was getting myself into when I went there. This kind of unique group of farmers and land stewards who are working in a totally different terrain, a totally different environment, no risk of RCMP enforcement. That was pretty good. And I just wanted to go and kind of reset. That was kind of the plan, was to reset for a few weeks, be an artist in residence in a new place, talk to some land stewards working in a different fashion, and begin to build a new way of thinking forward for myself, in accordance with what I just witnessed at Fairy Creek. But the terrain is really different there. So I found that I was getting in really, really close, talking with farmers out there about different cover crop species blends that can build grasslands in more sustainable ways, or ways in which livestock can be raised on these different types of crops that are being grown to make it so that they're healthier animals for making better sustainable food. All these kind of interesting, important ways of thinking about caring for the land, that was really opposite to what I just witnessed in a really visceral way at Fairy Creek. There's just a photo of some of those land stewards there, some of those farmers from Fairy Creek in the garden at the Dogs Run farm. I'm going to be going back there in just a couple of weeks to continue my work with Rachel McFarland, a painter from New York, who's coming up. And really, this project feels like it's at the beginning. I feel like I've got a lot of learning still to do out there, and I'm excited to get back out there. But my mind was really stuck on Fairy Creek, I got to say, even while I was there. This is, I think, the most successful painting that I made, sitting under a big oak tree by their flat prairie bridge with their big, beautiful orange prairie sky. And I'm imagining that even though I'm trying to find a moment of solace there's a logging truck that whizzes by. Now, obviously, that's not going to happen in the middle of the prairies, but it felt like that for me. It felt like that was still the reality that I was living. And one other awesome part about going to Harvest Moon was getting to work with Elder Dave Scott from Swan Lake First Nations, about 30 minutes away from the Harvest Moon Society. I feel like this is a new relationship that I'm building as well. He's informed my color decisions in a really unique way so far. Some of the paintings I'm about to show you are spoken through with Elder Dave, talk through compositional values, aesthetic values, color values, and stuff like that. I've got this really great opportunity to work with somebody who has been a land steward in that particular piece of the world since for a lineage that's there since time immemorial. And I'm very excited to continue my work with Elder Dave when I'm back there in just a few weeks. But like I said, my mind was really stuck in Fairy Creek, and I miss my friends. We did all this crazy stuff in the woods. It all had to happen at night because there's helicopter flyovers. This is us setting up a tripod in the middle of the night, which is just a way to block the road so that the trucks can't drive by. So when I left Harvest Moon, for the first time, I went to my new studio in Northwest Ontario, and I dipped back in to the Fairy Creek work. Instead of making plein air paintings, now I was making studio paintings, very different flow, much more meditative, thoughtful, thought through approach. And I began to think, well, how can I be more meticulous about building a narrative that's going to have an impact on the viewer in a way that makes them think differently about land stewardship as well. The plein air paintings, of course, they're bright and colorful. I think that they're pretty easy to look at in some cases. So I wanted to carry those values forward, but use the slower composition building that was afforded to me in the studio to help flesh out some of these narratives. And that takes us up to December of 2021. So just a few months ago, I'd started showing with a new art gallery in Toronto, Bogie Gallery. I knew that I had a show coming up in a few months. It's open right now. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but in anticipation of that show, I realized that in order for myself to have the most effective, impactful exhibition, I wanted to build a narrative that was about my experience out west in a way that hopefully bridged a gap to the east, to the folks out here. I'm in Georgian Bay right now, coincidentally. So to the folks in Georgian Bay in Toronto, a way that could bring those narratives of what's happening out west to an urban Eastern Canadian setting. Because climate change affects us all. And if we lose those ecosystems, well, the air and climate environment, it's going to change here too, So I thought that I had a real unique opportunity to tell that story. My exhibition is called Hold On. It opened on last Saturday. Very grateful to have Janet there at the opening to talk through the work. It's open till the 30th. So if you want to see it, you can go in person. But I wanted to share those images with you tonight to kind of wrap up this presentation. So there are two things that I thought about in the context of this show. First was, what are we holding on to personally, you know, in our own lives? What are we holding on to? Well, we've got our home spaces, you know, we obviously don't want to lose those, especially thinking about the rising water from my experience at Georgian Bay. If climate change gets worse and those things keep happening and there's bigger snowfall and bigger flooding in the spring, you know, our shorelines are going to get rearranged. So we've got things like home spaces. We also have personal comfort. We have air and all these all types of food and stuff that we put into our body. Resource extraction is a lot more than just trees, you know, it's the different plants and animals and stuff like that we're going to eat. All of that's at stake here, you know, so we got to hold on to that stuff. So the first series of paintings that I wanted to fit into this show were paintings that showed what was at stake for us. What did we have to hold on to? So again, coming back to these scenes of burning homes, flooded trees, more West Coast scenes, again, leaning on that experience that I had at Fairy Creek. This kind of notion that like we're being forced into scenarios where we have to coincide, we have to cooperate with the changing environment. So imagining that the staircase down to the lake now just kind of runs right into the lake, that there is no more beach. Where are you going to go if you are boat access only, or if you just got a small hold up cabin, or maybe there's fire coming over the other side of the hill, you know, there's a lot of things that we have to hold on to in our own lives. I don't know if this, oh, it does play. I also made an animation. I'd never done anything like this before. And I wanted to make a visual representation of a figure kind of coming to terms with exactly that. Like, oh shoot, like the fire's here already, the flood's here already, what am I gonna do? So this is it's now turned into a 6.5 hour animation that has one central loop that just kind of plays over and over. This is only about 20 seconds of that big loop that I have for you in this short presentation tonight, just so that you can get a little taste of what's happening here. But I thought that bringing motion into these paintings was hopefully a way to make a more visceral impact on a viewer if they were looking at a figure kind of moving around in a space that was about to be overtaken by fire. This is what it looked like installed in the gallery on a really bright, clean 4K TV with a fancy frame. So giving the illusion that it's just a moving painting. That's the illusion that I wanted to have with this piece. I also wanted to think about a recreation in a certain way. You know, that's something that we all love to do. That's one of the great things about going out to the lake, getting out on the river. This was the river at Fairy Creek, right behind that studio tent where I stayed. And I imagine myself painting on that river, similar to that painting with the really tall white trees, where I'm painting the river, sitting on my canoe, but I'm completely surrounded by all the logging, and the painting that I'm making, instead of showing the environment as it is, I'm showing the environment on fire. So a little bit of a switch from more physical object type things that we have to hold on to, making a switch into maybe even the act of holding on a little bit, like I'm trying to hold on to what's left of the environment there by painting a representation of it for myself to have later on. That's just a little close up of me in my canoe on the river. Yeah, a lot of the photos that I revisited for this series of work from Fairy Creek were challenging to look at even after the fact in the studio. Chickweed was as far as I was concerned, Chickweed was the leader of Eden Camp where I stayed. They were kind of the person that everybody went to for advice, whether it was how to forage for edible stuff in the grove or how to talk to RCMP. Chickweed was the one that we went to talk to for advice. So I wanted to show that connection that Chickweed had, not just with the other forest protectors, but most importantly with the land. So here's Chickweed holding on to a flower that's come up to meet her as she's standing on a stump, on an old growth stump on a big cedar, like that photo that I had of her from a day we went bushwhacking, trying to find an alternative route. Yeah, countless ecosystems go when we cut those trees. Like I'd mentioned earlier, never mind the salmon. One thing that I learned when I was out there is that there's species of crabs that live in the canopy that were just recently discovered that have got scooped up by rain or transpiration or whatever might have you. There's crabs living in the canopy. That's just one example. There's all, of course, there's bears and deer and cougars and all this type of big animals. There's all kinds of insects and birds. The endangered goshawk was a bird that we tried to find while I was out there as a way to stop the logging. The western screech owl as well. You know, these things that are going to go extinct well beyond just the forest. And this was an attempt to show that by really exaggerating the amount of salmon in the lake and showing that all those trees are about to get cut and they're going to pinch out that lake and there's not going to be any more salmon. And then I realized that to flesh out the narrative, I needed to actually show the act of holding on. Yeah, when I was working as press, I got to witness some pretty remarkable things. Dolphin was locked on there. That's the photo on the right. Dolphin was locked in there for 22 hours, holding on to what we called a mast. Some camps might have called it something different, but at Eden, we called it a mast. So I realized that again, with that slower studio meditation on my documentation, I could set up scenes that hopefully would have a little bit of a bigger impact. Maybe they weren't quite exactly what happened out there, but maybe they reflected a little bit more of the harsh reality, the real truth. Chickawood told me that the reason why painting is important is because it's more real than the real. And I think that this painting maybe shows that. You know, it's incredibly exaggerated in its how dramatic it is, but in essence, this happened. You know, this scene happened, and I very lucky that I got to bear witness. I was also really just still stuck on that nest, you know, that nest under the bridge with the bus at the end and the truck. I really was super just fascinated by that thing, you know, everything that went into building it, what was required to perform it. But we never got to do that because the RCMP, they tactics when they came to Eden. They brought militarized RCMP in the middle of the night and basically woke everybody up. We were one of the first camps. We unfortunately didn't anticipate that, and they kind of just steamrolled through all the things that we had set up, and nobody ever got in the nest. So it felt important for me to paint the nest as though it happened, paint the flying dragon as though it happened. So again, with that slow studio meditation, I took a bunch of photos of RCMP that I collected from my time as press, and I collaged them together. And I imagined what would have happened that day if a forest protector did actually make it into the flying dragon. Yeah, and last is the sleeping dragon, which is the one tactic that did get utilized that day. It was the sleeping dragon right at the top of the road. And when the RCMP came and started harassing everybody in the middle of the night, there was one forest protector who was quick thinking enough to jump right into the sleeping dragon. That's Mackie. So Mackie, they're locked armpit deep into the earth, and they're not going anywhere unless the RCMP gets them out of there. And the RCMP is going to do that at all costs. You know, again, we knew that we weren't going to stop them entirely, but we could sure as heck slow them down. So they brought in a backhoe and countless other officials, and they spent about 3 hours that morning digging Mackie out. And it was important for me to also represent that as a painting. This painting, yeah, it's a collection of images from RCMP that day, as well as the backhoe collaged together in Photoshop, you know, kind of like to make a cohesive image that I could more easily imagine painting. And then I used that as the reference point for bringing this into reality in paint. Yeah, it was also a lot more, I think, poetic to imagine Mackie actually holding onto the root of a tree while the tree was holding on to Mackie instead of just locked into a tube. I'm very grateful that I got to have an ongoing conversation with Mackie throughout this painting, as well as with Chickweed and several other forest protectors who were advisors on all of these paintings as I made them, and their contribution to the work is completely invaluable. There would be no paintings without those people. This show opened, as I said, on Saturday. It's open right now at Bogie Gallery, just across from the AGO. Very lucky to have the words of the forest protectors in the paintings on the wall beside the paintings. So if you want to know what it was like, what it felt like that day to be doing these things, or to be making these things, or to be scared of these things, you can read about it in the gallery. But unfortunately, nothing's changed, you know, logging continues. I found out that coincidentally, the first tripod got set up on the day that my show opened as the new logging season continues. John Horgan just said that there's going to be a whole bunch of new logging deferrals, 20,000 hectares or something like that. Well, some of those are alpine trees that would never get cut. Some are in a national park. Some of them he just deferred for 2 years, so there's just all this, once again, new logging season, a whole bunch of new rhetoric that looks good for the news. But what's actually happening is they're just trying to play a little bit of whack-a-mole to make it so that the forest protectors can't be as organized. They're doing everything they can to take those trees. The RCMP's now spent more than $10 million in enforcement. That's more than the value of the trees in which we're directly protecting. I've heard several different estimates of what the value of Fairy Creek as a whole is worth. I have no idea which one to believe, but I feel pretty confident that in terms of the pockets of areas of the land that we're directly trying to defend right now from immediate logging, that's probably somewhere in the like $8 or $9 million range. So the fact that RCMP now have spent more money on enforcement than the value of the timber that they're trying to extract shows you that there's something else going on here that's a lot more than just resource extraction. There's a desperate need for a rethinking of what land stewardship means in this context, especially when 85% of British Columbians want action for old growth and only 16% think that the government is doing a good job. This is from the Sierra Club, who I've worked with extensively over the last year, doing talks just like this one, trying to raise awareness. And it's because, yeah, we can't let it happen anymore. This is from just a couple of weeks ago by the turnoff to my old studio on Cowichan territory. If that makes you upset, you can call John Horgan, even though you might not live in BC, and tell him what you think. We're all Canadians, we're all in this together. And in addition to supporting the Georgian Bay Land Trust, which of course is incredibly important for land conservation in your own backyard, if you'd like to help make a difference out west, I'm also now working with the Nature-Based Solutions, which is a new foundation that's an offshoot of the Ancient Forest Alliance. And their plan is to create new deferrals and new forest management systems through Indigenous-led initiatives by raising private funds to plug those funding holes in other more governmental or national organization funding. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you so much, Kyle. That was an excellent presentation. Not easy material, but you've done an amazing job of showing what you experienced and sharing that with us. So thank you very much. If anyone has questions for Kyle, please go ahead and type them in the chat box now. We've got some time for questions. Kyle, I just wanted to ask you first, how did the forest protectors respond to the work as you were doing it when you were out there? I know you talked about the people who came to serve the injunction were impacted by it, but what did you see, among the community you were with? What kind of impact was there from you being there as an artist?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's something that I'm honestly still humbled by, because I remember going out there and thinking like, these people are so badass, for lack of a better word, like, wow. I remember the first night I met Chickweed, she said, I'm here to put my body between those saws and those trees. I never met anybody like that. So I went out there thinking like, I'm going to do everything that I can to make the lives of these people easier. I was always the one who was like trying to volunteer to do the dishes or help with cooking or whatever, making sure the fire was always going. I was trying to, when I wasn't painting out in the bush, I was always trying to help the forest protectors, because I was like, they got a lot more on their plate than I do. But I was surprised that they put that back on me. I think that there was something unique about Eden Camp. Again, like I said, there was a lot of creative thinkers in particular at that camp, but they were really insistent that like, no, what you're doing is important. And not just for myself, but in particular, Jeremy too, the other painter that I mentioned that I was out there with, they really were like, your work is incredibly valuable, and they could see that right away. So they are always like, well, can we help you? Do you need help carrying your painting out into the bush? Let us cook you dinner. Don't worry about doing the dishes. They really went above and beyond to make sure that myself and the other artists that was out there, Jeremy and a couple others that came out, they really went out of their way to make sure that we were well accommodated. And I just don't know how to thank them. You know, it's really resonated with me. I'm so grateful to have carried these relationships forward. I'm so grateful to call these people my friends and advisors in painting still to this day.
That's amazing. Okay, well, we've got some just comments coming in here thanking you for your presentation, saying you are a warrior with heart. Thank you for turning your talent to this important work. Wish Emily Carr was here tonight. And a couple other comments as well, just yeah, people who appreciated the presentation. Yeah, you mentioned there were some other artists out there with you. Sort of in general, this path you've taken on you know, incorporating land stewardship and art. How much are you collaborating with other artists? Are there other people doing similar things, or how much are you kind of carving this path for yourself?
Well, there's a really long lineage of artists doing things like this. Up until Fairy Creek, the second biggest civil disobedient act in Canadian history was in the Carmana Valley, where Robert Bateman and Gordon Smith and Jack Shadbolt, really famous Canadian painters, went out there and did essentially same thing that I was doing now, you know, making different types of paintings, but going to the front lines of old growth logging at the blockades and making work. And that was in the 80s. So this is not new, and I'm very grateful that I can fit into that particular history of Canadian art. But in a contemporary sense, definitely my kind of partner in crime out there was Jeremy Herndall. He was making portraits of trees, of the ancient trees. One of the things that the Pacheedaht people really believe is that those ancient trees are avatars for their ancestors. And I can't speak entirely for Jeremy, but I think that kind of a sentiment played into his decision to go out there and make portraits. So he took 5 by 6 foot canvases into the woods, and he would paint kind of just like the bottom 6 or so feet. He'd try and paint it in an almost 1-to-1 scale, and he would sit there and really meticulously, representationally, with realistic color, try and give that tradition of portraiture to these ancient trees. And I really thought that was a beautiful sentiment. Heather Kai Smith was another artist who spent some time at the blockades. I went to grad school with her at Emily Carr. She was making charcoal drawings of our circle meetings and of kind of daily life around camp, the bus that some folks lived in and stuff like that. And then of course there's several Indigenous artists that are making work about this too. There's Randy Cook, who was an artist in residence there as well. He's from further north on Vancouver Island, but his contribution was incredibly important to this as well. There's a show opening on June 25th in Victoria that is an accumulation of people making work about the crisis right now happening in our ancient forests. Many of those people are making work specifically about the Fairy Creek blockades, but some of them aren't. Some of them are making work about issues around old growth logging on the mainland and other parts of BC. And this show is really trying to bring it all together, curated by Jesse Demers. And that's at the Legacy Gallery on June 25th. I'd be happy to share more information about that if anybody's out west.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, if you want to send that maybe to Janet or I, we can put it in the follow-up email.
Great.
Okay, question here from Helen. Do you think you will make more paintings from your Manitoba visit?
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I feel bad that was such a shortened part of the presentation, because that's really heavy on my mind right now. I'm about to go back there in just a couple of weeks, as I had mentioned. I think that there might even be a little chance for me to be more involved in the society in a more organizational way. I think that's going to happen, with maybe helping this residency grow beyond just my experience. But I just haven't had enough time there yet to really let it impact my work on a longer scale, like my time at Fairy Creek. In total, I was at Fairy Creek for almost 4 months. Whereas Harvest Moon Society, I've just kind of been dropping in and out for the last 3, I've gone 3 times now over the last 6 months, and getting my bearings there. But it feels like a really important place for me to be, not just for the land stewardship opportunities with these really unique farmers and gardeners that are there, but also with Elder Dave. And absolutely, there'll be work coming out of Southern Manitoba for sure.
Okay, great. Janet's wondering if you can tell us more about Big Lonely Doug. What's in his future?
Oh, wow. Well, has anybody read The Golden Spruce? Do you guys know that book? Like, do you cut it down? Do you not cut it down? What's the right thing for the tree? That's a really complex question, Janet, because these forests thrive with community. They hold each other up. There's evidence in some cases where old growth forests will continue to push nutrients into stumps of fallen trees for up to 400 to 500 years after that tree fell. So with things like that in mind, we know that Doug is burning in the wind, essentially. You know, his entire support system, all of his community is gone. He is standing alone in the middle of a clear cut, being scorched by the sun every day. He doesn't have the support of the canopy from the other trees around him. He doesn't have the same push of nutrients coming up through the soil and his root systems. It's kind of a bit torturous for that tree to stand there alone. On the flip side of that, what an incredible ambassador, you know, what an unbelievable sign of why we need to do something about this crisis with our ancient forests. So what's the value there? Is it more valuable to have a tree like that with a book written about it that you can find on Google Maps and take a day trip to and see with your own eyes and learn more about conservation and land stewardship through the tree? Or is it merciful to cut that tree down and let it suffer again? I'm not sure. But that's kind of the state of Doug right now.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
Incredible.
that's interesting. Okay, I don't see any more questions here. I just had one last question for you. If you were to come back to Georgian Bay to paint after all this experience, what would you be most interested to do or see or paint?
I think the biggest thing that has shifted in my practice since I've been at Georgian Bay, I think, is my it's kind of maybe a silly way to phrase it, but my like one-to-one kind of in the moment recording ability or something like that. You know, like when I'm painting, I like to think of myself as the antenna. Like when I'm painting outside, all the sensory information that's coming up from the earth, whether that's from the water, from the land, or from the stars or the moon or whatever, all that's being absorbed in my body. And I'm acting as the antenna in the moment to translate it visually on the canvas or on the paper. And I think I was just kind of at the beginning of learning how to do that when I first got to Georgian Bay in 2019. Now, I know that my time as the King Family Bursary recipient is long since passed. However, I would like to imagine that this could be an ongoing relationship, you know, and if I wanted to come back out with all this new kind of technical ability that I have, I just want to bring oil paint and big canvas, and I want to sit and really serve as that antenna for longer, slower moments in the same spot, rather than that kind of like island hopping, watercolor here, watercolor there, back to the cabin, you know, kind of tasting a bunch of things. I'd rather just kind of come and really stew in it for a long time. If that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah, well, we'd love to have you back. So anytime.
Absolutely.
That would be great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Kyle. We've got more messages coming in from people thanking you for this, and I'd just like to echo that. It was a fantastic presentation. And as Kyle mentioned, he's got his show on in Toronto until the end of the month. So anyone in Toronto, it's a great opportunity to see the work in person. It's always different in person. It's so much more impactful. So yeah, thank you so much, Kyle. I will just hand it over to Janet for a few closing remarks.
Kyle, I just reiterate everything that has been said in the chat box, and you're an incredible storyteller, not just in your paintings, but in how you talked us through all this tonight. You kind of moved me a little bit, so I thank you for that. And of course, you can come back to the Georgian Bay. We will always have a place for you, always.
Thank you, Janet.
So next month, our guest speaker is Aaron Rusak, who is our new Protected Areas Manager, who will be sharing his passion for birding with a review of birds of Georgian Bay. So we hope to see you next month, May 16th from 7 to 8. And that's it for now. Thank you, Kyle, for your incredible work. Thank you, all of you attendees, for coming, and have yourself a lovely evening. Good night.